Let's talk about stuffing gnomes. There are a couple of things to think about, and we will be using this small sort of teaching gnome for this, and some of the things I will be talking about apply more to the bigger gnomes, and some of them apply more to the smaller gnomes. And so we're just going to talk about things in general. So you will need some kind of fluffy stuffing, and you will need some kind of weighted stuffing. I have a video talking about all the materials and a lot of the options if you are interested in that, which will be linked below. In general, people who live where it is not as dry and cold in winter as where I live don't like to use edible goods because they have more pests than I do, but I'm going to be using lentils today. So let's get started. When you begin stuffing, there are two questions to ask yourself. The first question to ask yourself is, what do you want the hat to be like? If you want the hat to stand up, then you're going to stuff all the way. If you want the hat to maybe flop over or to look like there's a head inside it and then change shape above that, you're going to do what I like to think of as a fake head. So let's talk about the fake head option first. To do the fake head, what you will need to do is take some stuffing and you will need to ball it up, and you will need to make it very snug, and then have a look and see, is it roughly the size of your head? Too small? Keep going, keep adding. What we're looking to do is to create sort of a stopper at the top of the gnome that will stop, that is thick enough, stiff enough, and will expand a little bit when we let go into this space to sort of stop everything and keep the rest of the stuffing from coming up. So this needs to be, it will be surprising how much stuffing you put into this. Another option for you is to put, to kind of get this right, and then put it in the toe of an old pair of stockings or something like that and tie it off, and that might help a little as well. So let's say we're going to try, I still want that to be even bigger. All right. Now, it's a trick. It's a balance between getting it big enough that it will lodge in there firmly and not so enormous that your head is going to look very hard and unwelcoming. This technique is less good for children. If you're going to be giving this to someone as a toy, this stuffing, and they're going to be hugging it a lot, you probably want to just stuff the whole hat. So let's see, I've got my hat. You can see that I'm kind of pinching it down, this fake head, because I want it to be smaller. I put it in, and I want to push it till about a third of it is above the line where we picked up stitches. All right. The reason we do that is because we don't want to fill too much of the hat, but we want to make it look like there's a head in there. All right. Now, I used the wrong size needles for this yarn. It is a little too gappy. You can see I'm already starting to see some stuffing through. So note to self, I don't get to use these needles with this worsted weight yarn anymore. I must have had a very relaxing week. All right, so we've stuffed a fake head, and that's one option. And then we would simply stuff most of the rest of the body with fluffy stuffing and then weighted stuffing and then go on, which we will do in a moment. But let's talk about the second method of stuffing the head, which is just to stuff the head. If we are just stuffing, the number one principle is to use small amounts. When you use big amounts, they're big and lumpy. So let's use these as an example. If we have these here, you can see that right here there's a big gap in the space, whereas if we had the same space and we filled it with small amounts, we can be much more subtle and thorough in filling things. So big balls tend to lead to lumpy toys. So we're going to stuff. We are going to stuff well, and we are going to stuff slowly. So if you are stuffing something with a pointy top and you are really struggling to get it up there, just think about using a pencil. The eraser on the pencil is a really good thing to push it up there. You can also use knitting needles, but of course because they're pointy, they're just going to often stab right through the stuffing. So get your stuffing you want to pull it apart a little bit so that we can decide how it gets stuffed in. If we were to put this in, it's already so compacted that it's going to make its own decisions about the shape it is, whereas if we kind of pull things apart, it is easier. All right, I like to hold the gnome with my thumb and forefinger, kind of making a circle. It makes a platform on which to do this, and depending on what stage of the gnome you're at and how big it is, you can actually kind of pull it down, the body down, so that we don't have to go as far in to deal with things. Now, normally you would deal with this end before you stuff things, but I'm going to be using it for a demonstration, and after all, dealing with ends with stuffed animals and stuffies will no longer scare us just after we look at that video. All right, so I've got my thin amount of stuffing, and I'm just going to work it until we're in there. I don't stuff the I-cord part. I just get up to the point where the I-cord would have started if there's sort of a decorative I-cord top. I-cord is not something that is really stuffable. You can put wires in there or pipe cleaners or something like that. Now be careful when you're stuffing that you want to look for sort of firmness without distorting the shape too much. You want to support the shape of what you knit rather than changing it. And the hat can be less firmly stuffed than the body because, of course, the body is going to have the weight of things and we want it to do the heavy lifting, whereas the hat can be sort of more lightly stuffed. Once you've gotten over the awkward narrow bits, one of the techniques I use is to think about laying it in sort of like sedimentary. So if we had this already in our gnome, and then we put this layer already in our gnome, and then we put this layer in on our gnome, we're building up layers rather than, again, balls. I like to put a layer in, and then I like to take my fingers, maybe even just the thumb and my finger because there's not enough room, but if you kind of put it in and then just kind of scrape, open up your hand, you can take that and push it to the ends and fill in the shape of it. Use your fingertips to sense where there are little gaps or holes or something like that, to see what's going on, because we can't see what's going on. So just use your fingertips to kind of sense what's going on. And like I said, if you can use the rest of your left hand or the hand you're not using to just kind of like squeeze it from the outside, because again, we don't want to be distorting the shape of what we knit. And we never want to be knitting or stuffing so much that we can see the stuffing through. We don't want to like stretch those stitches open. You will use far more fluffy stuffing than you think is reasonable. It's just the way of things. All right, so that's about right for the hat. I'm going to close up the body a little bit, then I will stuff the body, and we'll come back for that. As I mentioned, I like to stuff the body and the hat, usually not the same level of firmness, so this might be a little less full. That also changes the center of balance, and one of the things we're trying to do when we stuff a gnome is to make sure that the center of the balance is towards the bottom, because otherwise they become quite tippy. They are usually long and narrow. Stuffing the body is basically the same as stuffing the head. I take small amounts that I have kind of stretched out, and I simply put them in, and then I use my hands and I straighten them to the edges. Put it in, move it around, in, around. All right, now where the balance point is and where you stop using fluffy stuffing and switch to weighted stuffing really is something that is more of an art form than a science. For each gnome pattern, I try to give a sense of roughly where I think the proportions are that work, but some things are heavier than others. I've even noticed, like when I'm using beans, some beans are heavier than other beans. So you're gonna have to kind of get a little bit of a sense for it. So usually I like to stuff about 2/3, 3/4 if it's a bigger gnome with the fluffy stuffing. Then we close it up a bit more, and then we put the weighted stuffing in. All right, we have stuffed up most of our body, we have closed most of our bottom, and now we're going to put the weighted stuffing in. If you want, you can enclose it inside a nylon or one of those little toe socks. Some people sew little pouches for them, or buy little jewelry bags, the little pouches. A lot of Etsy purchases come with them. I'm just gonna dump mine right in, and I like to brace either my needles or the, if I've got them on circulars, I brace the cords on my thumb and finger. It'll fill up, you'll poke it in, and it'll seem like you added nothing. Fill it in. As we work to keep our gnome standing rather than tipping, one thing to note is that this pearl line that I use in almost every gnome is the point I want you to stop stuffing. If we stuff beyond that pearl line, then it won't lie flat. So we don't want it to round above that. We want that to be the turning point. So think about stuffing up to the pearl ridge. Then we need to sew. We need to keep knitting, and this can jump out, and that's obviously quite annoying. So what I like to do is I like to get a very thin amount of fluffy stuffing and just use it as a cap. Again, we're not wanting to stuff because if this builds up at all, it's hard for it to be stable. So I would put a little bit in, I would just tuck it, I get it flat, kind of like a plate, and then I just stuff it to the edges. And then as I'm continuing to work, the fluffy stuffing will keep that weighted stuffing from popping out. This is a good time to talk about that balance point again. When you are holding this, you want to feel like the gnome is definitely weighted to the bottom here so that it will be more likely to stand up. Another point to talk about is depending on what you're going to put in the bottom, this makes it more or less safe for children. So this brings up the point here. I talked about using washers to stuff, and as weighted stuffing, this one is too big for this, which is why I won't be demonstrating it with this gnome. But if you were to put this in, you might want to do it before. It depends on how you get it in. You can sort of wait till fairly near the end, as long as you can get it in without distorting too much. You will then have to knit around it. Some people, not for weight, but merely for standing, use something like cardboard, or there is some stiff felt material that is another option some people use. And you would just place that in at this point and then work around it. Don't make it too big. You want the circle to be within the size of the pearl ridge. So it can even be a little bit smaller than that. The key is just to be giving it just a bit of a base to be resting on. And the last point is that, especially with larger gnomes, once you have them stuffed with weighted stuffing, as you work these last stitches, the weight of it can really be pulling, and that will distort the stitches as you make them. They will tend to be bigger, looser, floppier stitches. So at this point, I suggest putting it in your lap, on a table, or maybe in a glass or a wine glass or something as you work these last few quick decrease rounds. I hope this helps you. Remember, everything I talk about are guidelines. If you find a way of doing it that works for you, please live your life happily, gnome the way that works for you, and come tell us about it on the Ravelry boards and other places, because a lot of these things are tips I've learned from other people, and we are all smarter together. Happy gnoming.